And introduce Senator Mike Foote. So Senator Foote currently represents Senate District 17. Before that, he served for 6 years in the Colorado House of Representatives. He is the chair of the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee, and in 2019, he was the Senate sponsor of SB 19-042, the National Popular Vote bill that you are being asked to affirm on your ballot this year. So once again, if anyone has questions for Senator Foote, please ask them in the questions area, and take it away.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for allowing us to join you on your Sunday morning and talk about the National Popular Vote. It's an exciting topic for me, and I hope for you as well. I hope you enjoyed the movie, and I will strive to not repeat really too much of what you heard in the movie already, but get into some more background or some detail about the National Popular Vote, and then we'll go into questions, because what Sylvia said at the beginning, that's really the best part of this presentation. Hear what's on your mind and see if we can go directly towards that. So right at the beginning, Jane mentioned a couple of times about the complexity of the National Popular Vote, and I wanted to put a little context around that, because on the one hand, how we do elections and certainly how we would do a presidential election can be complex. There's a 1,000-page book that's written about the National Popular Vote that has everything you could possibly know about the National Popular Vote in it. But also, you don't have to have a PhD to really understand how it works, because at the base of it, the National Popular Vote works the same way that all of our other elections work. And that is really three concepts that you'll remember, and I hope that you'll take away from this presentation. The first is, under a National Popular Vote, the vote for president would actually adhere to the concept of one person, one vote. One person, one vote applies to every other election that we have. One person equals one vote, and every voter is treated equally. But that's not the way that our presidential elections work right now, and I'll go into that in a little more detail here in a couple of minutes. And then the second concept is that presidential campaigns presidential candidates should campaign throughout the entire country. They should campaign in states that they're not campaigning in now. They should campaign in swing states and non-swing states. They should campaign in rural areas and urban areas and suburban areas. And that's not what they're doing right now. They're just focusing on a couple of states. So number two is candidates should campaign across the country. And number three, the presidential candidate that wins the most votes should win the election, period. That's not how it has worked. It's actually not worked that way 5 times in our history, including 2 of the last 3 presidents. But like everything else, the candidate that wins the most votes should actually win. So one person, one vote, candidates should campaign across the country, and the candidate that gets the most votes should win the election. That's really what it comes down to. But like was said earlier, there's plenty of details that we can get into, and I'm sure we'll get into some of them as we go on. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint presentation, which is about 12 slides. So we won't be doing death by PowerPoint here this morning, but I just want something for you all to look at while we're going through it, instead of just looking at me talking to you. So the movie mentioned this. I was one of the legislative sponsors of the National Popular Vote. This is probably the closest we get to an action shot that we have as legislators, where I was debating the National Popular Vote on the floor. It was a very robust debate, as well as in the committees. Once it ultimately did pass in 2019, and Governor Polis signed it. So that made us a member of the National Popular Vote Agreement, along with 15 other states and Washington, D.C. And 15 other states include small states, big states, and medium-sized states like Colorado. Just in 2019 alone, we had 4 states join it, and that included Colorado, Delaware, New Mexico, and Oregon. So East Coast, West Coast, Mountain Region, it really doesn't matter what kind of state you are. What it matters is that you're a state that wants to make sure that one person equals one vote, and that the most votes should actually win in a presidential campaign. But I ran the National Popular Vote bill because I think it's the single most effective reform we can put into place for our democracy at the state level. There's lots of things that I think could be improved about the way that our government works. And probably everyone on this call agrees with that, maybe disagrees with the types of things that we should do, but I think agrees that we could definitely use improvement. But the way we elect our president is specified in the Constitution as a state activity. States actually choose their presidential electors. States have the exclusive authority under Article 2, Section 1 of the United States Constitution to qualify and select and allocate their presidential electors in the way that they see fit. So that's an exclusive state authority and a state remedy, and it goes to how we actually elect our president. I find that to be quite exciting and also of great potential to make sure that we can put in a reform that would actually make a huge difference in how our presidents are selected and also how they govern. So getting into the three concepts that I talked about earlier, I'll go into them in a little more detail. Number one, under a national popular vote, unlike the current system, every voter and every vote will matter. Every voter and every vote will count, no matter where that voter lives, no matter what the election. So one person will truly equal one vote under a national popular vote, just like it happens under every other election. So currently, you probably know, you probably knew before even watching the movie that you just watched, but certainly the movie talked about this. Currently, 48 out of 50 states have what's called a winner-take-all system, which means that the presidential candidate that wins the most votes within that particular state gets all of the state's electoral votes. So if it's a two-person race, then the candidate that gets 50% plus one ends up getting all of the electoral votes in those particular states, including Colorado's 9 electoral votes. So under a winner-take-all system, that means that 49.999% of those voters and those votes actually can get tossed out the window because they're not in the majority. They do not go to a grand total, a countrywide total for the vote of president. And that's what's caused the second place winner syndrome that I'll go over in just a couple of minutes. But so for example, in Colorado, I'll just give you a 2016 example. In Colorado, 1.2 million Coloradans voted for Donald Trump for president back in 2016. But because 1.3 million Coloradans voted for Hillary Clinton, that meant that the 1.2 million Colorado votes for Trump ended up just getting tossed aside. They meant nothing. They did not go towards a grand total at all. Hillary Clinton got 1.3 million Coloradan votes, and therefore she got every single one of the electoral votes, the 9 electoral votes in the state of Colorado, despite the fact that 1.2 million Coloradans voted for the other candidate. And it's, of course, not exclusive to Colorado. If you take the numbers of people that voted for the Democratic candidate in 2016 in Utah, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma, that also adds up to about 1.2 million people in those states that voted for Hillary Clinton. But Hillary Clinton got 0 electoral votes from those states as well because the Democrats were in the minority in those states that are surrounding us that I just mentioned. So it applies to Colorado and it applies to 47 other states. If you happen to be in the minority in those states currently, your vote does not count towards a vote for president. It does not count towards a nationwide grand total. And that's a shame. And people realize that. They realize if they live in a state, if they're a Republican voter that lives in a blue state, their vote for president doesn't really matter. They also realize if they're a Democratic voter in a red state, their vote for president doesn't really matter. And that's a huge shame. It leads to cynicism, and it also leads to depressed voter turnout. Just imagine, for example, if we had that system in place for our vote for governor or our vote for attorney general. Let's just say that in heavily Republican El Paso County, the Democratic votes for governor didn't count at all. They were just tossed aside. Let's say in heavily Democratic Denver, the Republican votes for governor were just tossed aside. Well, I imagine that there would be a lot of people that would be very upset about that, and they would be up in arms about that and demanding reform. Yet that's exactly the system we have in place for our president right now, and that's what the national popular vote will change. It will make sure that everybody's vote matters, everybody's vote counts nationwide, no matter where that person lives. They could be a Republican in Illinois or a Democrat in Mississippi. It doesn't matter. Your vote equals the same as anybody else's, and it counts towards the grand total for the presidency. So secondly, candidates for the president should actually be campaigning across the country. The president and vice president, of course, are our only two nationwide elected offices. They should be representing the entire country. But under the current system, this is what the map of the United States looks like to those presidential candidates. These are the states that they care about. These are what are called competitive swing states or battleground states. These are the states that could go either way in the presidential election. Sometimes people call them toss-up states. And so therefore, these are the states that get the vast majority of attention from presidential candidates. They get the vast majority of visits from those presidential candidates and vice presidential candidates. They get the vast amount of polling, advertising, organization. It doesn't mean that there's not some advertising or organization in other states, but certainly these are the states that the presidential candidates care most about. So they really care about what farmers in Wisconsin think, or they really care about what the tourism industry in Florida looks like. They really care about what voters in Arizona care about and their issues in those communities. They really care about coal miners in Pennsylvania, for example. But they don't really pay much attention to voters across the country. And this goes for big states, small states, and medium states. And you notice that Colorado is not on the list because we are not considered a competitive swing state at this point in time. We have been in the past. We were considered a swing state in 2008 and 2012 and 2016, but there's really no credible source now that puts Colorado on that list, or really news organization that's paying attention to Colorado. So Colorado at this point is considered not a swing state, but we also have joined about 40 other swing states, or non-swing states, I should say. So 40 other states that are not on the radar with the presidential campaigns. And we see that even as the general campaign for 2020 is heating up. The presidential candidates are visiting places like Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina. I think President Trump just had a rally there last night, and Florida. And that's where they're going because those are the states that they're paying most attention to in order to win the presidency. The national popular vote takes all of this out of the equation, and it makes every state a swing state. It makes the entire country a so-called battleground country, because the candidates that under a national popular vote, the candidates would have to campaign everywhere in order to win the majority of votes in order to win the presidency, instead of just focusing on 6 or 7 swing states. Third, the candidate that gets the most votes nationwide should actually win the presidency. And this is a concept that should not sound all that unfamiliar to people, because that's how we elect every single other elected office in the entire country. The most votes should win. That's not happened under the current system, and the current system has actually led to second place winners being the prevailing candidate 5 separate times. And 2 of the last 3 presidents actually have prevailed by being the second place winner. Now, as I said, this is not how we run elections for anything else. It's certainly not how we run things like horse races or running races or cycling races or football games or anything. And nothing else in our society does the second place person actually win, except for potentially the presidency. And this is not really kind of a one-off, unusual type of thing either. As I mentioned, it's happened with 2 of the last 3 of our presidents, but also there's been near misses, several near misses over the last 25 to 50 years, the most recent being in 2004, where John Kerry lost the popular vote by over 500,000, but had he flipped just 60,000 votes in Ohio, he would have ended up becoming the president in 2004, even though he lost the popular vote. It's projected that Donald Trump could win the Electoral College again this year by losing the national popular vote by as many as 5 million votes. And so that's something that is certainly on the radar and could very much happen, according to many of the people that know a lot about how these elections occur. So really any time is an important time to talk about social and racial justice issues, but particularly now, it's an important time to talk about the social and racial justice issues and how the national popular vote would help those things. First of all, I think the film talked about this a little bit, but certainly you may know that the Electoral College was designed in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 1 is the language of the Electoral College. It's very general. It gives the states the plenary power to determine how their electors are selected and how they're allocated. But that was born from the Three-Fifths Compromise, which really set the representation in Congress, particularly the House of Representatives, back at the founding of the country and the drafting of the Constitution, which treated slaves as three-fifths of a person. Of course, slaves had no rights, including voting rights, but they were still treated as three-fifths of a person for the purposes of figuring out representation in Congress, which also translated into representation in the Electoral College. So what the practical effect of that was that Southern slaveholding states had disproportionate power and influence, not only in Congress, but also how we selected our president. And they certainly liked that. And I guess one can't necessarily blame them. But the Three-Fifths Compromise was amended out of the Constitution after the Civil War in the 14th Amendment. However, we've seen certainly since then, and it continues even today, particularly in some Southern states, suppression of the minority vote and disproportionate power of white Southerners, and that continues even today under the current system. The national popular vote actually would weaken that, and because everybody's vote would actually matter throughout the entire country, there still may be voter suppression. There certainly are people that want to continue to do voter suppression, but it will mean a lot less in the context of a presidential campaign, although it still will mean a lot probably for local campaigns. But national popular vote would help disincentivize voter suppression of this kind, at least for the presidential campaign. And finally, I think it's worth noting that going back to the discussion that we had with the safe states versus the non-state safe states, or the swing states versus the non-swing states, that the vast majority of our communities of color are located in non-swing states, or the states that aren't competitive, or states that the presidential campaigns are not really paying attention to. 69% of the African American vote, 76% of Latinx vote, 82% of Asian American vote is all in states that are not part of the presidential campaign radar. And so therefore those communities are not getting much attention, if at all, from any of those presidential candidates, because they need other communities in order to win. Now, of course, if you're the Cuban American community in Florida, you're getting a lot of attention because that's a swing state. If you're in the African American community in Detroit, you're getting a lot of attention because turnout matters there, and that's a swing state. But in the vast majority of states, that's just not happening, and that's unfortunate. But a national popular vote would certainly change that. So the national popular vote is something that we're very proud of that we passed in Colorado. We're also proud of the fact that we built a very strong coalition of supporting the national popular vote. Amongst them is the League of Women Voters, which actually has supported a national popular vote interstate agreement for president since 2006, when it was first introduced in its first state. And they've even supported a direct election for president back in 1970, which was right around that time, that clip that you saw of Birch Bayh, the senator from Indiana, that black and white clip you saw in the movie. So they've been on board for a long, long time to do something like this. And they continue to be big supporters of the national popular vote, and we really appreciate that. There are many other organizations that support the national popular vote, which I'll just kind of flip through here and not talk about them in any great detail. But we are very proud of the campaign that we've built here and the support that we've built in order to make sure that one person truly does equal one vote, and the most votes for president actually wins once enough states come on board. So this brings us to the most immediate issue, which is what's on your ballot coming up that you'll be getting here in a couple of weeks. And it is Proposition 113. Proposition 113 is just one paragraph long, and it's actually a fairly straightforward paragraph, which is really nice because that's not always the case when we get our ballot language and our ballot measures in front of us. It just asks the voters of the state of Colorado to approve what we in the legislature did and what the governor signed back in 2019. So it says, shall the following act of the General Assembly be approved? And that is an act concerning the adoption of an agreement amongst the states to elect the president by popular vote, otherwise known as Senate Bill 19-42. So if you believe in the national popular vote, if you believe that one person should truly equal one vote throughout the country, no matter where that person lives, when they elect a president, if you think that the presidential candidates should pay attention to voters across the country, and finally, if you think that the presidential candidate that gets the most votes throughout the country should actually win, then you should be a yes on the national popular vote, and you should be a yes on Proposition 113. So there's, as I mentioned before, there's tons of information about this. like I said, it can be boiled down to some pretty straightforward concepts in how we elect a president, but there's tons of information. The book I mentioned before is actually available online for free, and you can see a screenshot of the nationalpopularvote.com website that you can take a look at to answer any kind of myths or questions that might be coming up about the National Popular Vote, and you can take a look at it there at nationalpopularvote.com. The Colorado specific movement has a website as well, which is on nationalpopularvote.com. You see that towards the bottom there, as well as the nationalpopularvote.com website. So both of those have a plethora of information for you to take a look at if you want to dig into it deeper. And I'm sure that there'll be some questions that we can answer here as well that people have. But if there's questions that come up as you're thinking about it further or talking to other people, then please do take a look at those websites as well. And of course, we would love to have your help. If you believe in the National Popular Vote just like we do, then you can volunteer through Outreach Circle, and Sylvia can give more information about that because she's been doing a great job in organizing that. Our Facebook page is very active. We send updates out a couple times a day on the Facebook page. And of course, we can always use contributions and any help that you can give to this statewide campaign to make sure that we vote yes on Proposition 113. So I'm going to end it there because I was scrolling through the couple of questions before I started my presentation. And I know that there's some questions about some pretty common misperceptions about the National Popular Vote. And so I'll plan on addressing that in the questions section as opposed to this particular part of it. But we'll get to those questions and be able to answer some of the misperceptions that are out there about the National Popular Vote in the second part of the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of this PowerPoint, and hopefully everything will start working again. And it looks like it does. So I'll turn it back over to Sylvia to MC the Q&A part of it. But again, thank you very much for paying attention and being more interested in the National Popular Vote. Please vote yes on Proposition 113.
Well, and Jane was absolutely right. We have a lot of really great questions from this group. So what an awesome group. So I am going to start asking some of these. I know that you saw the first question from Kate, which is one that we get often. So we might as well just clear this up right out of the gate. How do we address the argument that National Popular Vote means Colorado's vote will be overwhelmed by California's vote, or California, New York, or California, New York, and Illinois, as sometimes are combined?
Yeah, so we hear this a lot. This is the main talking point of the opposition, and it really doesn't have any basis in math or reality, really. The current system, you have to keep in mind, first of all, the current system is such that California has more people than Colorado, so therefore, under the current system, California has more electoral votes than Colorado. Colorado is the 21st biggest state, so there's 20 states that have more presidential electors than Colorado. That's how it is under our current system. Now, there's some people that would like to change that, but that would require a constitutional amendment, and you know, I'm not even sure that's the right way to go. But the bottom line is, under our current system, California has more electoral votes than Colorado. There's nothing in the National Popular Vote that widens that disparity. We still have the same number of electors, and they still have the same number of electors under the National Popular Vote. So it doesn't make it any wider. It doesn't make it any narrower either. But just as California alone cannot determine who wins the presidency, or California, New York, or Illinois alone currently cannot determine who wins the presidency under the current system, they also cannot do so under the National Popular Vote either. They just don't have enough people. Now, typically when we hear California and New York are going to control the election, or, you know, currently California, New York, and Illinois are going to control the election, what that's really code for is Democrats are going to win the election each time, because they don't really mention the other states that are part of the top 5 or top 6 states. For example, Texas, for example, Florida, for example, Pennsylvania. The top 5 states in order of population are California, and then Texas, Florida, then New York, and then Pennsylvania. Those are the top 5. And so if you add up, for example, the population of Florida and Texas, those 2 states' population adds up to be about 10 million more people than the state of California. But we never hear the opposition say, well, you know, Florida and Texas are going to determine who the presidency is going to go to. That's just not what people say. And the reason why is because of basic math. You know, if you take those top 5 states, as I mentioned, California, then Texas, then Florida, then New York, and then Pennsylvania, and you look at their presidential votes in 2016, for example, they split it almost exactly down the middle, 50-50 between the Republican and the Democratic candidate. So a national popular vote will not give one party or the other an inherent advantage, even though the opponents like to kind of skirt around that and they like to try to bring up the specter of that, but it just won't. Just you take a look at the math and you can see that. One other way to take a look at it is ever since 1924, throughout the entire country, there have been 1.65 billion votes cast for president, 1.65 billion votes cast for president since 1924. And you look at the number of votes cast for the Democrat, and it's 828 million. The number of votes cast for the Republican is 828 million, all since 1924. So it's been quite divided down the middle, and the national popular vote does not give an inherent advantage to one or the other. You know, there's actually a lot of Republicans that live in blue states, just like there's a lot of Democrats that live in red states. And California has a lot of Republicans in it, even though they're not the majority. Texas has a lot of Democrats, even though they're not the majority. So the national popular vote is really a way to make sure that every vote counts, and it does not, contrary to the assertion of some of our opponents, give any kind of inherent advantage to one candidate or the other.
Beautiful. So along those lines, just to continue getting some of these out of the way, Martin brings up that the Mountain Mail, the publication in Chaffee County, just came out with a no endorsement. In that editorial, did you have a chance to read it? I can kind of summarize what their 2 points were. We just found it, for everybody that knows, we just found out about this literally a half hour before we got on the line today. So we didn't have a lot of time, but they went into the whole California. They listed California, New York, and Illinois, which you just addressed. But the other thing that they talked about was swing states. They talked about 2016 and that we had a lot of campaign visits from the presidential campaigns in 2016, implying that we're important and we're going to stop being important if we pass national popular vote. Can you address that for just a moment?
Right. Yeah. So interestingly, one of the members of the Conservatives for Yes on National Popular Vote campaign actually visited the Mountain Mail a couple of weeks ago and talked about Proposition 113 and tried some of the education, and got a commitment from the person they spoke with there to involve us and or Conservatives for National Popular Vote, their endorsement decision. They never called us back, of course. So that's unfortunate because we really could have cleared up a couple those 2 issues for them. The main one that you talked about was the blue states dominating or the Democrats dominating. We already talked about that. But then the other is whether or not Colorado still matters, or is it still a swing state? And I would just throw out this particular statistic. I think that would help illustrate what we've been talking about, which is back during President Obama's first term, he visited the state of Colorado 17 times personally himself, and he had events 17 times in the state of Colorado during his first 4 years. During President Trump's first 4 years, he visited Colorado twice. And once was last year to go to the Air Force Academy commencement ceremony and preside over that. And the other was in February, a big event for Cory Gardner, thanking him for his vote on the impeachment trial, his acquittal vote. And that's it. Now, President Trump has been having events all around the country, Biden less so. But he's been having events. He just had a big event in North Carolina last night. He had an indoor event in Nevada last week and an event in Arizona the day after that. So he's still having events. He's just not having events here in Colorado. And that's because his campaign realizes, just like Joe Biden's campaign realizes, that Colorado is not really a swing state anymore. And this actually matches the trajectory that we see for other states. There have been a lot of states that have been swing states in the past that have gone either red or blue and are not swing states anymore. And the typical cycles that it takes for that to happen is about 3 cycles. You look at Missouri back in the 90s. You look at Iowa back in the 90s through the 2000s. Those were considered swing states. Both of those states now are considered pretty red for the purposes of presidential campaigns, at least. Virginia is the opposite, where they were a very swing state, and now they're considered a blue state. Colorado's the same thing. So we aren't a swing state anymore. So we're not getting that same kind of attention from presidential candidates. We still see nationwide advertising here, and there's still some campaigning going on. And there's certainly some fundraising that's going on for the presidential candidates here, just like everywhere. But we're off the radar at this point, and for the most part with the presidential candidates. And that's too bad. I wish it was opposite. I wish it was different of that, because I personally liked it when the presidential candidates cared about Colorado and the issues that we cared about. But there's no credible source that puts Colorado in the swing state or toss-up state category. And after this, if you wanted to go back and take a look at your favorite news channel and they pull up some report about how polling is going or how things are going in certain states, they're going to list the states that I put on that map during the presentation. They're going to list Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Minnesota might be part of it. Nevada might be part of it. Florida and North Carolina. And that's what they're going to list as being the states that they're watching. So that's Colorado's current situation. But even if it weren't that situation, I think we should address the bigger picture, which is that even if Colorado were considered a swing state, which it's not, but even if it were, we would be one of 10 states that the presidential candidates would be paying attention to, which means that there's 40 states that they're not. And the presidential campaigns and the candidates themselves should actually care about the entire country, because they're representing the entire country. Swing state status comes and goes. For the most part, states are not swing states. And when they're not swing states, they should also matter, and their voters should matter. Colorado voters should matter, which they would under a national popular vote.
Exactly. All right. Tim is asking, what do the polls say about Proposition 113 passing?
Well, I'm not going to go back and talk about Proposition 113, because that's the name that was just given about a month ago or 2 months ago once the ballot was set. But anytime the national popular vote is polled in Colorado and elsewhere, it always gets good numbers. It's always in the majority. It's always something where the majority of people think that one person, one vote is actually a really important concept and something that they believe in. The national popular vote has been polled in states throughout the country tons and tons of times, because it's been a bill in many states since 2006. And so polling has occurred around this idea of one person, one vote, or a national popular vote around the country, including several times in Colorado. And it's been consistent. The majority of voters believe that one person, one vote and a national popular vote is the way to go and the way to elect our president. So I hope that translates into the ballot. I think that we are certainly running a campaign as hard as we possibly can, because there's a certain amount of confusion out there, and there's also a certain amount of misinformation out there put out by the opponents of one person, one vote that we have to try to address. Mm-hmm. So, but ask people in polling, what do you think about one person, one vote? What do you think about a national popular vote as opposed to the current system? The majority of people every single time think that it's a better idea and a better system than what we have now.
Yeah, and Kate asked a question that I think is a really good follow-up to what you just said. She's asking, can you clarify what a yes vote versus a no vote means for Proposition 113? I'm kind of reading that as what happens if it doesn't pass. What happens?
Okay, well, just to be clear at the beginning of this, yes means that we keep our membership in the national popular vote. Yes means that you're approving what the legislature and the governor did in 2019. So we continue to be in the national popular vote agreement, which won't take effect until enough states sign on, but we still would be part of the agreement if there's a yes vote statewide. A no vote withdraws us out of the agreement, which means that we're not part of the agreement anymore. And so, that technically speaking, that's what it does. But it also has bigger implications, because this is the first time that a national popular vote has actually been put towards the vote of an entire state. It's always been the legislature in that particular state putting themselves into the national popular vote interstate agreement. And so this kind of statewide vote actually has big implications across the country. If there is a yes vote, which we really hope that there is, of course, then that's going to be a huge boost for other states that are considering the national popular vote. And there are several that introduced the bill this year. They just didn't pass them because COVID really kind of put everything up into disarray. But several states are considering it, and a yes vote here, I think, would really reaffirm the power of the national popular vote and the popularity of it. And thirdly, or I should say on the other side of the coin, a no vote would really kind of throw water on the idea as well, because the opponents then, which are really based out of Oklahoma, there's a think tank out of Oklahoma that really is the spearhead for all the opposition. The opponents could go around to those states and say, look, Colorado rejected it, so you should too. So it's going to have big implications as to whether or not we get those additional 74 electoral votes that we need to put it into effect nationwide.
Okay. Kind of a similar question along these lines. Gay has asked a couple really interesting questions. One of them is, if predominantly blue states vote for this amendment, doesn't that give red states more influence?
Question before, no, I don't think so. I mean, so let me kind of just look at that in two different ways. First of all, at this point in time, where it has passed have been predominantly blue states. However, you're not going to be able to put it into effect until you have states that have at least one Republican-led chamber or Republican governor in it. So it's not going to be a blue states agreement. It has to include red states as well if it's going to actually go into effect. That's just the math of it. So so that probably should be explained, or I hope that I explained that okay. But at the end of the day, when a national popular vote takes effect, what that means is that every single American is going to have a vote that counts for president. And that's no matter where they live. So if you have someone that is a Republican that lives in a blue state or a Democrat that lives in a red state, their vote actually counts too. Last time there was 65 million votes from Americans for one candidate and 63 million votes for another candidate. And so I would anticipate we would have the same kind of thing under a national popular vote. So I don't think, like I said before, it gives any one particular candidate or party an inherent advantage. So I don't think it would give red states an inherent advantage either, because everyone's put on a level playing field. One person truly equals one vote. Every vote is equal no matter where that voter lives.
Right. And I think one of the things that's really worth emphasizing here that might still be a bit of confusion is that we have to have enough states join the compact to equal 270 electoral college votes, which is the majority. And so we essentially become a majority voting bloc. So Democratic states, if they are the ones that are predominantly passing this, are not disadvantaged because there's sort of this not unilaterally disarming. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, and also should point out, just to be clear, is that let's just say that we get enough states on board for 270 or 275 electoral votes that come on board.
Right.
It doesn't just mean that those votes are the only ones that actually count for a national popular vote. Once all of those voters come on board, or once all those states with electoral votes come on board, every single vote throughout the country actually counts, not just those that are in the member states. Because the mechanism, the way that it actually works when you boil it all down, is the presidential electors from each state that's a member state vote for the candidate that gets the most popular votes nationwide. So that's actually how it works at its base. And so if you have enough states with 270 electoral votes, the agreement goes into effect, they're going to end up voting for the candidate that gets the most votes nationwide. But the most votes nationwide is going to include every single state, every voter in every state to get to that grand total.
Right. Yep. People get confused about that sometimes, so thank you for clarifying that. And that's a perfect lead-in to a question from Danielle, who says, Senator Foote, can you address how the Electoral College process specifically would change under the national popular vote for president to avoid letting the runner-up win?
Yeah, well, I guess I kind of mentioned that. I didn't really But yeah, that's how it works. Right now, state law is that the candidate that gets the most votes throughout Colorado gets all of Colorado's electoral votes. The national popular vote at its base changes state law so that the candidate that gets the most popular votes throughout the country gets all of Colorado's electoral votes. And that's the same way for all the other states that are part of the agreement as well. The bill that we actually passed, Senate Bill 19-42, is a bill that is substantially similar to the bill that has been passed in the other states, the other 15 states plus DC at this point in time. So at its base, that's really how it works. So it works within the Electoral College, but it just changes the way that the electors vote as opposed to the winner-take-all system that we have statewide right now.
Right. And we've actually talked to county clerks around the state, and there really wouldn't be any impact in what they do. It's going to be exactly the same.
Right, yeah. County clerks still mail out the ballot. They still receive the ballot. They still count the votes. They still report the votes to the Secretary of State. Everything along those lines remains the same.
So I want to be sure and throw a question out there. I was waiting to see if anybody asked it, but I'm not seeing it. So one of the things that we hear that our opposition is saying sometimes is they are talking about how if the national popular vote passes, that this will somehow impact water rights in the state of Colorado, that California will have such huge influence that they're going to swoop in and take over all of Colorado's water rights. You want to talk about that for just a moment?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for bringing that up. I mean, it's there's no basis in truth for that. You know, unfortunately, I think that we have a little bit more of an incentive to make stuff up than not, and that certainly is in the category of it just makes stuff up. And why is because in order to get an interstate water compact, many things happen. First of all, there have to be negotiations, and the negotiations have to lead to a compact that's approved by all states in the compact. So Colorado would have to approve the compact. The state delegation from Colorado would have to approve it, just like the state delegation from Arizona or New Mexico or whatever states are involved in that compact would have to approve it. So that's step number one. Step number two, it's submitted to Congress, and Congress ends up having a vote as to whether or not the compact is approved. Now, we all know that every state has 2 U.S. senators. So Colorado has the same power when it comes to senators as New Mexico or Arizona or any other state. And so Colorado's senators would have to be on board with the compact as well. And if the Congress ultimately approves the compact, then it becomes law, and the water compact becomes in effect. Now, you'll notice one party that I completely left out of that, which is the President of the United States. And that's because the President has no role in interstate water compacts. Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution clearly lays out that the United States Congress is the one that approves interstate water compacts or any other type of interstate compact. And the president has no role in it. So it's not like passing a bill and making it a law. The president doesn't have the power to sign the bill or to veto the bill. The president just has no role. So this issue about water is something that I think speaks to a lot of people, and rightfully so. We're Colorado. We're very concerned about our water rights here compared to other states. But unfortunately, it has no basis in the truth whatsoever. And it's unfortunate that it's become part of the debate about the national popular vote. But here we are in the age of disinformation, and it certainly has crept its way into this particular ballot measure as well.
Yeah. So hopefully you guys will help us correct the record on that. Just real quick, Sue asked if the webinar is being filmed because she'd love to share it. Everybody is going to receive an email after we're done that's going to have a link to the presentation Senator Foote gave and the Q&A section. The Winner Take All movie won't be included in that. You have to kind of fast forward 30 minutes. But you can find Winner Take All on Amazon Prime. Okay, Sue has also asked, do you see the national popular vote impacting rural voters differently than urban voters?
Yeah, good question. I was actually going to get into that because that was something that we've heard as well. Mm-hmm. Ways to think about this. Number one, under the current system, if you are a rural voter and you happen to live in a state that is a flyover state or a non-competitive state or a non-swing state, the presidential candidates are currently not paying attention to you. So if you're a rural voter in South Dakota or Utah or now Colorado, or think of any particular state, there's rural voters in New York State, even though it's a heavily populated state in some areas. So rural voters in those states are not getting any attention from the presidential candidates, and their issues are not really getting to the forefront of what those presidential candidates are caring about. Now, if you happen to be a rural voter in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Minnesota or Wisconsin, then yeah, people are paying attention to you. But that's just because you happen to be in a swing state at this point in time. The vast majority of rural voters across the country, small states, big states, medium states, are not being paid attention to right now under the current system. The national popular vote would change that. And the reason why is because rural voters actually make up the same percentage of voters that those that live in the top 100 cities do. Those that live in the top 100 cities, and just to give you some context, Spokane, Washington is the 100th biggest city of about 200,000 people. Those that live in the top 100 cities make up 18% of our population. Those that live in rural areas also make up 18% of our population. And so it's the same number of people, roughly, it's about 59 million people that live in rural areas as live in the top 100 cities. And so that is a huge voting block that would be impossible or really, really stupid to ignore. One would never ignore a voting block that makes up 18% of the population when the candidate that has to get the most votes actually wins. So nobody would say under a national popular vote that the presidential candidates are just going to focus on the rural areas of the country. And I think that logic should be flipped over and say, well, yeah, that's true. As in addition, nobody would actually just focus on the top 100 cities either, because they make up 18% of the population. Now, if presidential candidates decided they wanted to focus on the top 100 cities or a subset of those top 100 cities, that's fine, but they're going to lose because the math's not there for them to win. And again, remember, there are a lot of Republicans that are in those top 100 cities, just like there's a lot of Democrats in the rural areas too. So nothing is monolithic, nothing is 100%. And presidential candidates, in order to win under a national popular vote, would have to speak to the majority of all voters, regardless of where that voter lives, and would actually have to come up with plans and really speak to the concerns of voters across the country, unlike the current system.
Beautiful. Gay is also asked, will passing this bill have an effect on a national presidential election before enough states pass a similar bill?
No, until it goes into effect. And we would know prior to that presidential election too. I mean, we would know the year or two prior to that presidential election if enough states are on board. So right now the current system is in effect. This certainly will not affect 2020. Your guess is as good as mine as what 2024 looks like, but it could be in effect by then if enough states come on board, and then it would change the way that presidential campaigns are run for sure.
And then this is my last question, unless we get a few more in here. This is also from Tim. He says, what are the cons as opposed to the pros of the national popular vote?
Well, we've kind of been over the claims of the opposition about what they say would happen under a national popular vote. I suppose, if you want to look at that question literally, one of the cons would be that if you do live in a swing state like Pennsylvania or Florida, especially Florida, because they've actually been a swing state longer than almost anybody else, then you're probably going to get less attention than you would otherwise. And so if you happen to be lucky enough to be one of the, say, 40 million Americans or 30 million Americans that live in a swing state right now, then you're probably going to see less of the presidential candidates in the future. However, as we've discussed, that means that the entire country is going to be paid attention to rather than just those, say, 6 or 8 swing states for a national popular vote. Right. I guess I'll address also this one last issue that I think is important to address under the guise of cons. The people ask whether or not it's constitutional or whether or not there's going to be litigation. And so my answer to that is both of those questions is going to be yes, it's constitutional, but yes, there will be litigation. Just like there's litigation for everything. No matter what we do in the legislature or what we don't do in the legislature, there's people always threatening litigation. And in this case, it's no different. In fact, that think tank out of Oklahoma that I mentioned earlier has already promised everybody that if the national popular vote goes into effect, there will be litigation, no matter what. But I think the litigation will go badly for them because the Constitution is very clear under Article 2, Section 1, that the states have the exclusive authority to determine how their presidential electors are allocated. So it's a state-based system. That's one of the main things the founders did, is give states a power under our federalist system. And that's one of those powers that the founders gave to the states, the powers to determine how their electors are allocated and therefore how the president is elected. So I think they're going to have some real trouble making the case that it's unconstitutional, but that's not going to stop them from trying. They're very opposed to changing the current system. And so they're going to file some kind of a lawsuit, I'm sure.
We did have one more question pop up, and that is by Danielle. And I can either read off the answer or you can test your memory. She's asking which other states have already signed on to the popular vote. So I went and cut and pasted the whole list off of the NPV website, but do you want to go for it, or do you want me just to read them?
Let's see if I can remember it. So I might get one or two wrong. So Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Colorado, New Mexico, California, Washington, Oregon, and Hawaii. I remember.
Okay. Well, this list is in alphabetical order. So It's California, Colorado, Connecticut, the District of Columbia, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Washington. I think you did pretty darn well. You got 10 of them, which
yeah, I should be better on that. I'll try to remember that for the next time. But what's interesting about that list is, a lot of people point out that currently those are states that are blue states. It wasn't always that way, and there was significant Republican support within many of those states that passed their membership into the national popular vote. And that's because in those states it was not a Republican or Democratic issue, but what those states have in common is they all are flyover states. They all are states where the presidential campaigns don't really concern themselves with and they don't really care about. And they don't have any kind of similarity in size or geography. I mean, Delaware versus Washington State or Hawaii versus Massachusetts. I mean, there's no similarity there really. But the only similarity is that the presidential candidates in the general election don't campaign there, and they haven't really listened to the people that live there and their issues. So that's why they think that a national popular vote is the solution. And that's why we thought so too in the legislature. And we certainly hope the majority of Coloradans will agree by voting yes on 113.
Yeah, this really wasn't a partisan issue until 2016. And that's when we saw a lot of Republican support really slip away. So hopefully that's going to change.
You never, like I said before, I'll let you wrap up, but I always like to point out that we really, in 2006, when this bill was first introduced, it was first introduced in Colorado, actually. It was the first state where the bill was introduced, and It took times to pass here. But the first state that passed it was Maryland in 2007. And so nobody really, I don't think, except for maybe an episode of The Simpsons, could have ever predicted President Trump being president in 2016 and how it went down. So things are unpredictable. As much as we like to think we know how it's going to go down, we just don't really know. And so let's just say in the foreseeable future, we have the state of Texas that goes blue by, say, 10,000 votes, just razor thin margin in a state of millions. Well, I think at that point in time, and I'm a skeptical, like I'll say I'm skeptical of that happening this year, but let's say it happens in 2024. I think at that point in time, we're going to see a big shift in what some Republicans think about the current electoral college system, because really without Texas, there's no way they can win that either. Mm-hmm. So know how things are going to go. The National Popular Vote's been around for 15 years. And so I know that the founders of it are in it for the long haul. And they kind of look at it like, look, no matter what the circumstances throw, we still believe, first and foremost, that one person should equal one vote and that the most popular vote should win the presidency. And so whatever the landscape looks like, they'll continue pushing on. But I think us passing 113 this fall is going to be a really nice boost in that too. So I don't want to discount that. But the bottom line is you never know. And we could see Republican support coming back at some point in time whenever Trump is out of the picture.
Right. Well said. So I think that, we've got about 3 minutes before the specified end time at 11:30. So I think this is a good time to wrap up. I just wanted to send out sincere thanks to Jane Jolly and the Central Colorado Humanists. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And we hope that everyone decides to vote yes. And if you are really jazzed up, I've put the link for our volunteer form in the chat box there and my email address. And thank you so much.
Thank you.